Okay, so we're going to continue on our discussion on using properties to solve equations. And in the previous lesson, we looked at the addition and subtraction property of equality. In this lesson, we're going to look at the multiplication and division properties of equality. And altogether, those four properties will give you enough ammunition to solve all kinds of equations. It's not all of them, but it'll give you enough to solve quite a few. So let's kind of review the previous topic. So in the previous topic, we saw this. We saw that adding or subtracting the same quantity to both sides of an equation results in an equivalent equation. So for example, real quickly, we saw this, and I'll just do one just to remind you. So if I have x plus 5 equals, let's say, 7, then what this is saying is that if I subtract 5 from the left-hand side and subtract 5 from the right-hand side, then this following statement that I'm about to write is equivalent to the original. So 5 and a negative 5 is 0, so I get x to be 2. So that statement is equivalent to the previous one. In fact, we also know that since x is by itself, then this is called the solution. Then this is the solution of this equation. Kind of makes sense because 2 plus 5 is 7. Okay? But what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the multiplication and division properties of equality. So let's look at this. Okay, so the multiplication and division property of equality. So we're gonna make the statement that A, B, and C must be real numbers. Okay, and I'm also going to make this statement, and you're going to see why. I'm also going to make that statement since we are talking about the multiplication division properties of equality that C cannot equal 0, and there's a reason. You're going to see that in a little while. Okay, so C cannot equal 0. So if I say if A equals B, if A equals B, then we're going to write this over and leave some space between them. If A equals B, then if I multiply the left-hand side by C, then I have to do the same thing to the right-hand side. So if I multiply the left-hand side by C, I have to do the same thing to the other side. So what I do to one side, I do to the other. Okay, kind of makes sense because if I have, let's say, 4 equals 4, that's a true statement. And if I multiply this by 3, then I've got to multiply this by 3 to make it equivalent still. 4 times 3 is 12, and then 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, so that's what that statement says. But remember, though, you can multiply by any real number but 0, because when solving an equation, if you multiply by 0, the variables disappear. There's nothing there. So you cannot multiply by 0. Now let me make this other statement why that's true. Okay, so we know that 4 is that this is a false statement. So we know that 4 equals 2. That's a false. I'm sorry. We know that 4 does not equal 2, right? 4 does not equal 2. But if I multiply both sides by 0 times 0 times 0, then this is 0, this is 0, and now 0 equals 0. But remember, the original statement was not true, so you cannot go from an untrue statement to a true statement. So that's why you cannot multiply by 0, because 0 kind of throws this whole thing off that you began with. All right, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so now division says this. Division property says this. If A equals B, then let me go ahead and rewrite it over. If A equals B, then, and that should be then right here as well, then if I divide the left side by C, I have to divide the right side by C. Okay? And notice I said C cannot be 0, because remember, you cannot divide by 0. Dividing by 0 is undefined. So if I say 7 divided by 0, that's undefined. That makes no sense. You cannot divide by 0. So that's why with division we say that we cannot, C cannot be 0. We cannot divide by 0 because it makes it undefined. All right. Okay, so now we're going to go directly now into some problems. So as we go through those problems, we're going to use only the multiplication division properties. In the next lesson, we're going to combine all of those. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and look at some examples. Okay, so we have this first equation, this linear equation. I have 3x equals 4. Now, you can look at this and determine what the solution is, because in your mind, you know that 3 times 4 is 12, so x equals 12. All right, but you must show your work. You must show how you're getting the solution mathematically. So you must show that. So look at what we have here. We have the variable x and is being multiplied by 3. Now I want you to remember this 3 here is called the coefficient. So I'm going to write the word coefficient. coefficient. So the coefficient is the number you're multiplying the variable by. So that's going to be important to use. All right, so since I'm multiplying the variable by the coefficient 3, I'm going to do the opposite of multiplication. So the opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm going to use the division property of equality here. So division property of equality. Okay? All right, so I'm going to write this over. All right, remember the division property of equality says if I divide one side by a number that's not 0, then I got to do the same thing to the other side. So if I want to get x by itself, right now I'm multiplying by 3. The opposite is divide by 3. All right, just like this. All right, only by the coefficient. Don't put an x down here. Only the coefficient. And then let's reduce. So remember, 3 divided by 3. I want you to remember this. 3 divided by 3 is 1, right? Okay, so 3 divided by 3 is 1. 1 times x is x, equal 12 divided by 3 is 4. And there's your solution. And so you can always mentally check 3 times 4 is 12. All right, but that's your work. That's you showing that you use the division property of equality. Now I just want to remind you also, I'm going to put this as 1 star just to kind of tell you this. So the same equation. So I just want you to see that in some textbooks, they won't even talk about the division property. They'll just mention the multiplication property, because division is a consequence of multiplication. And what that means is this. So instead of dividing both sides by 3, you could have multiplied. I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over just to show you. So instead of multiplying both sides by 3, you could have multiplied both sides by the reciprocal of the coefficient. Reciprocal of the coefficient. And so the reciprocal of 3 is 1/3. So here I'm using multiplication property of equality now. Multiplication property of equality. Okay? So division is a consequence of the multiplication property. What I do to one side, see if I'm going to multiply the left side by 1/3, I got to multiply the right side by 1/3. And it makes sense because look, what is 1/3 of 3? So 1/3 times 3 is 1, right? And then 1 times 3, that's 1, I'm sorry, and then 1 times x is x. And then 12 times 1/3, 3 into 3 is 1, 3 into 12 is 4, 4 times 1 is 4. So you get that. Okay? All right. So you get the same thing. So notice in this problem I use the division property of equality. In this problem I use the multiplication property of equality. Same example, 2 different ways. All right. Okay. I'm just going to say this though, but most students will use the way that's easiest for them, and this one's easier to use than this one. Okay. So number 2. So let's look at number 2. So number 2, let's suppose we had. Let's say 8 equals a negative 2x. 8 equals a negative 2x. All right. So notice that the variable term appears on the right side. So if you want to, I just want to just say this. If you want to, you can use a transitive property to reverse this. So if 8 equals negative 2x, then negative 2x equals 8, and it does not matter which of these equations you use because they're the same equation. All right. So if you want to use this one, you can. If you want to use this one, you can. All right, but remember the whole idea to solve this equation is to isolate that variable, get that variable by itself. Well, think about what you have here. On this side, if you read it correctly, this says negative 2 times x, right? So that negative 2 is the coefficient. And so if I want to get x by itself, you do the opposite. Let me go ahead and write this over. And so the opposite of multiplying by negative 2 is to divide both sides by negative 2. Just like this. What I do to one side, I do to the other. If you're doing this correctly, if you go back to the term that has a variable, this right here, if you're doing this correctly now, this right here, when you reduce, better be 1. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. So that's 1. And 1 times x is x, equal, and then 8 divided by negative 2 is a negative 4. And so there's your solution. That's your solution. And you can always check it. You can always check, right? Go back to the original. Here's the original. And in place of x, I'm going to substitute negative 4. So is 8 equal to negative 2 times a negative 4? And the answer is yes, because negative 2 times a negative 4 is a positive 8. All right? So that was number 2. All right? Not difficult at all. Very simple, just using those multiplication and division properties of equality. Okay, so let's look at this one. This is number 3. So number 3, we have negative w equals 5. Now, I just want to remind you that another way to read negative w is this. So you can read it as negative w, just like I stated, or you can say the opposite of w. Okay? So sometimes for some students it's a little bit harder to determine the solution here. So think about it this way. So this is saying the opposite of what number is 5. Okay? So the opposite of what number is 5. So some of you may know the answer right away, may know the solution right away. So you know that the opposite of a negative 5 is 5. So that should be negative 5 we get for w. But we're going to do this algebraically. So here's how you have to do this. So you don't see a number there. You just see a negative in front of that w, right? So rewrite this to where there's a number there. So there's no number. If you don't see a number there, it's implied to be 1. So rewrite this as negative 1w equals 5. Negative 1w equals 5. So to get w by itself, right now I'm multiplying by negative 1. I'm multiplying by negative 1. So the coefficient of w is negative 1. So since I'm multiplying by negative 1, the opposite is to divide by negative 1. So I'm using the division property of equality. I'm using division property of equality. Okay? Equality. And so remember, look at this right here. Negative 1 divided by negative 1. Remember, you always want to ask yourself, you want this to be a 1. So negative 1 divided by negative 1, anything divided by itself is 1. 1 times w is w, and 5 divided by negative 1 is a negative 5. And so there's your solution. Kind of makes sense because the opposite of a negative 5 is 5. Okay, number 4. So let's go to number 4. So in number 4, we have that same idea. All right, so the opposite of what number is negative 7. So if you can't look at this and think about what it is, then do it algebraically. Now you have to do it algebraically to begin with, but you could have intuitively determined what the solution is before you began in this case. But let's go ahead and work it out algebraically because you will be asked to do that. So rewrite this to where you see a number, an actual number there. Instead of saying negative x, say negative 1x equals negative 7. And so just like the previous problem, all right, so right now the coefficient of x is negative 1. This negative 1 is a coefficient because you're multiplying it by x. And let me go ahead and rewrite this over. And so the opposite of multiplying by negative 1 is to divide by negative 1, just like this. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is 1. 1 times x is x. And negative 7 divided by negative 1 is a positive 7. So there's your solution. That's your solution. Kind of makes sense because the opposite of 7 is negative 7. All right, so again, here I use the division property of equality. Division property of equality. Okay, so now let's look at this one. Number 5, we have 1/3 of x is equal to 6. 1/3 of x is equal to 6. Now, you can look at this and intuitively determine what the solution is. 1/3 of what number is 6? Can some of you tell me what that is? 1/3 of what number is 6? And so if you said 18, that's correct. 1/3 of 18 is 6. So the solution, when we do this, you should get x to be 18. All right, now, I want you to think about that coefficient. So that coefficient is 1/3, right? So there are a couple ways you could do this. I'm going to show you both ways. So if you want to think about it like we did with let's say number 1 here, where we divided both sides by 3, you could do that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and use, for this case, let's use the division property of equality. Property of equality. So that's one way. I'm going to show you that one way. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. Okay, and listen carefully. So right now I'm multiplying by 1/3, right? So the opposite of multiplying by 1/3 is to divide by 1/3. So we divide both sides by 1/3, just like this. 1/3 divided by 1/3 is 1. 1 times x is x. Equal. All right, now we've got to deal with this. So you got to remember something that you learned in a previous course. Something you learned in a previous course. So remember when you divided fractions? So when divided fractions, you change that division symbol. We're going to rewrite this. When dividing fractions, so this is a review from previous course. When dividing fractions, you change this division to multiplication problem. And so what you did was you said, well, I'm going to take the numerator, which is 6, and I'm going to multiply it by the reciprocal of the denominator. Well, the reciprocal of 1/3 is 3. And so you get 6 times 3, which is 18. Okay? And so you get x to be 18. Now that's one way. Here's another way you can do number 5. So in this way, we use the division property of equalities, because notice I divided both sides by 1/3. Let's look at number 5 this way. So number 5 this way, 1/3 equals 6. I'm sorry, 1/3 x equals 6. We're going to use the multiplication property. Use multiplication property of equality. All right, so I'm going to rewrite this over. 1/3 x equals 6. So when using the multiplication property of equality, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply both sides by a number. Okay? So here, when using the division property of equality, I divided both sides by a number, in this case a coefficient. Here, I'm going to multiply. Now, be careful. So the way you're going to do that, the way you're going to use the multiplication property of equality is this way. Remember, you want the coefficient of x to be a 1, right? That's what you want. So that's why we divided by 1/3, was to get that to be a 1. 1/3 divided by 1/3 is 1. But when multiplying, to get this to be a 1, when multiplying, you got to multiply this fraction by the reciprocal. So what's the reciprocal of 1/3? The reciprocal of 1/3 is 3. So that's what you have to multiply that by. So if you're going to use the multiplication property of equality, you have to multiply by the reciprocal. Makes sense. Remember when we did this one here? When I said you could use the multiplication property, we multiplied by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 3 is 1/3, and we did that to both sides. Same thing, okay? Same thing. So what I do to one side, I do to the other. 3 times 1/3 is 1. 1 times x is x, and x equals 6 times 3, which is 18. Okay? So it does not matter whether you use the division property of equality or if you use the multiplication property of equality. Okay? All right, so let's look at number 6. So this is number 6. So number 6, let's suppose we had 2/3 x is equal to, let's say 8. 2/3 x is equal to 8. Okay, let's do it both ways. Let's go ahead and do it both ways. We're going to use the the division property of equality, and we're going to use the multiplication property of equality because I need for you to understand both ways, because that's going to help you later on as well. All right, so let's look at this. So let's go ahead, first of all, and use the division property of equality. Division property of equality. So I have 2/3 x is equal to 8. I'm just going to rewrite this over. All right, so remember, when you read this, you read it as 2/3 times x. So I'm multiplying x by 2/3. So 2/3 is the coefficient. So to get x by itself, I could divide both sides by 2/3. So hence the division property of equality. What I do to one side, I do to the other. If I divide this side by 2/3, I've got to divide this side by 2/3. And then simplifying, I know that 2/3 divided by 2/3 is 1, right? So I got 1 times x is x. And then I got to figure out this side. So I'm going to change, so notice I'm dividing two fractions, 8 divided by 2/3. So I'm going to change this division to multiplication. So I'm going to say 8 times the reciprocal of 2/3. And the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. Okay, and then I'm going to reduce. So I'm multiplying these two numbers now. So 2 and 2 is 1, 2 and 8 is 4, and I get 4 times 3, which is 12. So x equals 12. Okay? All right, let's do number 6 again, but this time let's use the, and I think I can do it here. Let's use the same page. So now we're going to use the multiplication property of equality. Multiplication property of equality. So we had 2/3 x is equal to 8. Okay? All right, so when using the multiplication property of equality, remember you got to multiply both sides by a number. And you want this right here to be 1, to end up being 1. This product, whatever you put here, you want this product to be 1. Well, if you have a fraction, in order to get that number times another number to be 1, you got to multiply by its reciprocal. So what's reciprocal of 2/3? The reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. But what I do to the left-hand side, I have to do to the right-hand side. And you see this right here? Looks like this, right? And so the 3's divide out, the 2's divide out, and so this is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. So you get x equal. And then same thing, 2 and a 2 is 1, 2 and an 8 is 4, 4 times 3 is 12. Not difficult at all, right? Very simple. Either use the division property of equality or use the multiplication property of equality. Does not matter, okay? All right, let's look at a couple more. Okay, so let's suppose we had this one. So let's go ahead and we're going to do this in both ways again. So let's go ahead and use the division property of equality. Division property of equality. And let me go ahead and write this over. Negative 1/4 x equals 3. And so if I'm trying to get x by itself, we're now multiplying by negative 1/4. Negative 1/4. And so division property of equality says that I'm going to have to divide both sides by the same number. So if I want this to be x, I've got to divide by the coefficient. So the opposite of multiplying by negative 1/4 is to divide by negative 1/4, both sides, just like that. And so now negative 1/4 divided by negative 1/4 is 1. 1 times x is x, and then I do the same thing I did before. So change this to multiplication problem. So I get 3 times the reciprocal of negative 1/4. The reciprocal of negative 1/4 is a negative 4. So 3 times negative 4 is a negative 12. Okay, so there's your solution there. And it kind of makes sense because if you check it, if you do check, negative 1/4 times a negative 12, and you want to see that's equal 3. And it is. Negative 1/4 times a negative 12 is a positive 3. Okay, now let's use the multiplication property. Use the multiplication property of equality. All right, so let me go ahead and rewrite this over. So you get negative 1/4 x equals 3. Okay, so the idea now, remember, when you use the multiplication property of equality, is that you're going to multiply both sides by a number. And whatever you multiply this by, you want this product right here to be 1. So this is negative 1/4, and you have to multiply by its reciprocal. So the reciprocal of negative 1/4 is a negative 4. Many students mess up and put 4 there, and it's not 4 only for the reason because if you put 4, a positive times a negative is a negative. So you'll have a negative x, and then you have to go a little bit further. So the reciprocal of negative 1/4 is a negative 4. Keep that in mind. And so negative 4 times a negative 1/4 is now a positive 1, and 1 times x is x. Oops, I forgot to multiply by this side. What you do to the left, you do to the right, and you get x to be negative 12, which is what we got. Okay? All right, let's look at number 8. So in number 8, we have this. We have 2 thirds x is equal to, let's say, 1/4. 2/3 x is equal to 1/4. Now, don't make this complicated. You see fractions of both sides, but don't let that throw you off. It's not that difficult. It's fairly simple to do. It's the same process you've been working on. So I'm going to go ahead and use the division property of equality. Division property of equality. And so I'm going to divide to get x by itself. Right now I'm multiplying by 2/3. So I'm going to divide by 2/3, just like this. Okay? And so 2/3 divided by 2/3 is 1. 1 times x is x. And now I do just like I did before. I'm going to take so I'm dividing two fractions. So I'm going to take the top fraction. I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of the fractions in the denominator. So the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. And I cannot reduce, so I get 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 2 is 8. So I get 3/8. So there's your solution. Okay? And you can check it. So go back to the original, 2/3 times x. I'm saying x is 3/8, right? And you want to see if that's going to equal 1/4. Well, reduce, 2 into 2 is 1, 2 into 8 is 4, the 3's divide out, 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 4 is 4, and those are equal. Okay? And if you want to use the multiplication property of equality, same idea. Multiplication property of equality. I'm going to rewrite this over just to show you what to do. So in this case, remember you're going to multiply both sides by a real number. And when you do that, you want this product right here to be a 1. So in order to get a 1, you have to multiply 2/3 by its reciprocal. The reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. And look, this right here looks like this. Okay? So the 3's divide out, the 2's divide out, and you get your 1. 1 times 1 is 1. So 1 times x is x, equal. And then you get 3. Oops. Let's see. Did I mess something up here? Oh, no, I'm good. So 3. So that's be what? 3/8? Okay? So there's your solution, just like we did here. All right? Okay, let's look at number 9. So number 9, let's suppose we had this in number 9. Let's suppose we had a negative 3/4 of x is equal to, let's say, 2/5. So negative 3/4 x equals 2/5. All right, so what's the first thing you're going to do? And let's just do one approach. I'm not going to do both. Let's go ahead in this case and use the division property of equality. So using the division property of equality, we're going to read this over. And I'm not going to do both because of our time constraint. So we're going to divide both sides by negative 3/4, right? Negative 3/4, just like this. And then the negative 3/4 divided by negative 3/4 is 1. 1 times x is x, equal. And then I'm going to take the top fraction. So I'm going to change this to division. Change division to multiplication and take the top fraction multiplied by the reciprocal of the fractions in the denominator. So the reciprocal of negative 3/4 is a negative 4/3. Okay? And then reduce if you can. I cannot reduce here. So 2 times negative 4 is a negative 8. 5 times 3 is 15. So you get negative 8/15. All right, and so that's your solution. Okay? All right, now let's look at a couple of decimals, problems with decimals in it. Well, before we do that, before we look at the decimals, let's look at this because some of you, when you see something like this, it throws you off. So there are a couple of ways you can think about this. So if you read it, it says x divided by 3, right? X divided by 3. And so I'm just rewriting this over. And so if I have x divided by 3, notice right now I'm dividing by 3, just like it's kind of just like we did in number 1 when we had 3x. So right now I'm multiplying by 3. The opposite is divide by 3. Here I am dividing by 3, so it's the opposite. The opposite is to multiply by 3. And so the 3's divide out, and so you get 1 times x is x equal negative 15. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you check it, negative 15 divided by 3, and the question is that equal to negative 5? And the answer is yes, they are equal. Okay. Now another way you could have done, just to let you know, because sometimes it's important to see this. So the other way to have saw this is this. So I want you to understand that x divided by 3, you see that number, let me rewrite this over just kind of tell you. See that number right here, that's understood to be a 1, right? So you can think of this as 1/3 times x. 1/3 times x equals negative 5, just like that. Okay, 1/3 times x equals negative 5. So x divided by 3 means the same thing as 1/3 x. Okay, and so if you want to, you can multiply both sides by 3, multiply by the reciprocal. So now this is 1. 1 times x is x equal negative 15. Okay, all right. So I just wanted to see that, just to be aware that you could see situations like that. All right, so let's suppose we had this equation, this linear equation. We have decimals this time. That's 3.2 right here. So, but don't let that throw you off. Same idea. The easiest way to do with decimals is to think about what you have here on the variable term. So when you read this right here, you read it as 3.2 times x. That's what you do. That's the operation. So right away, what I would do is I would think about the opposite. So that's supposed to be x right here. So what's the opposite of multiplying by 3.2? The opposite of multiplying by 3.2 is to divide by 3.2. So divide both sides by 3 and 2/10, so 3.2, right? So this right here is 1. That's the whole idea. To get 1 times x here. 1 times x is x. And then just use your calculator. So keep in mind, though, a negative divided by positive is a negative. So 4.864 divided by 3.2 gives us that. But remember, it's negative because a negative divided by positive is a negative. So negative 1.52. Okay? So negative 1 and 52 hundredths. All right, and then finally number 12. Suppose we had negative 2.32, so negative 2 and 32 hundredths equals negative 0.4x. So 0 and negative 4/10 x. All right, so same idea, except this time you're multiplying x by negative 0.4. I'm going to go ahead and just rewrite this over. All right, so right now you're multiplying x by negative 0.4, so the opposite is to divide by negative 0.4, just like we're doing here, negative, okay? And so negative 0.4 divided by negative 0.4 is 1. 1 times x is x equal, and then use your calculator. First of all, a negative divided by negative is a positive. So 2.32 divided by 0.4 equals 5.8. So it'll be positive 5.8. Okay? And you can check it real quickly on your calculator. So in place of x right here, substitute 5.8. So ask yourself, negative 0.04 times 5.8 equals, I put 0.04 instead. So negative 0.4 times 5.8 equals negative 2.32, which is what we had here. Okay? All right, so that is, and let me go ahead and find the the first page. So that is the lesson on using the multiplication and division properties of equality to solve linear equations.